I joined the workforce in January 1971 when I was employed as a psychologist class 1 with the Commonwealth Acoustic Laboratories, as they were then known. There were about 10 new graduates taken on that year, and I was the only male. When it came to our first payday, we lined up to receive our pay packet from the paymaster, who arrived accompanied by an armed guard. We were given our pay in a little envelope and were required to count it in the presence of the paymaster to ensure we had the correct amount. My female contemporaries were not impressed when they discovered that their pay was less than mine, although they had the same qualifications and were doing the same work. They were penalised because of their gender. Women in the public service at that time were only paid 90% of the male salary. That injustice was remedied the following year when Gough Whitlam came to power and legislated that men and women in government service would have equal pay. Well, today's gospel reading is about apparent injustice in the workplace. It's usually referred to as the parable of the labourers in the vineyard, and it's found only in Matthew's gospel. In typical fashion, Jesus takes a situation that would have been very familiar to his readers and then introduces an entirely unexpected element. The ancient workday lasted roughly from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The Jewish law demanded that day labourers be paid on a daily basis because of their rather tenuous existence. The Jewish work ethic, rather like the Protestant work ethic, was summed up in a rabbinical saying, according to the labour is the reward. So the scenario Jesus describes begins with a scene that would have been well known to his hearers, although they may have been surprised that it was the landowner himself who went to the marketplace looking for workers. The denarius was the accepted daily wage, considered enough to feed a family for a day. And this is what the master agrees to pay the workers recruited at 6 a.m. The unusual thing about this landowner is his determination to find work for everybody. He goes out again at 9, at midday, at 3, and finally again at 5 o'clock. Human beings are created for meaningful work. Clearly, work is not the only thing we're made for. But when we read the creation account in Genesis, we find God putting Adam and Eve in the garden to till it and to keep it. We are to share in the care and maintenance of God's creation. Sadly, we've often done a terrible job in that area. Too often, human greed and selfishness has led to the degrading of God's good creation. And although many people now have to work in jobs that are not fulfilling or rewarding, the principle remains that God's intention was for humanity to be engaged in productive activity. To lock people away in a prison or a detention centre without the possibility of any meaningful occupation is to deny an important part of their humanity. Idleness is unhealthy for the body and the spirit. The landowner in the parable is a very determined recruiter. He's willing to take on the 5 o'clockers, the people whom no one else wants to employ. The fact that they wanted work is shown by the fact that they were still hanging around the marketplace. If they were just lazy, they would have gone home or wandered off to the local tavern. In his ministry, Jesus noticed the people that others overlooked. He went in search of the waifs and strays, the people thought too sick, too sinful, or just too unattractive. The invitation to work in his vineyard was very inclusive, as evidenced by the people who became his followers. While the day work finished, the landowner gets his manager to pay the workers. He starts with the 5 o'clockers and they receive a day's pay, but so do those who were recruited at 3 p.m, noon, 9 a.m, and 6 a.m. Everybody gets a day's wage. Well, while it's true that those employed at 6 a.m. had agreed to work for the day's wage, we can understand their annoyance when they notice that those recruited last are paid the same amount. The landowner's generosity to the latecomers appears completely unjust to the people who worked hard all day. But to understand this parable, we need to remember that this is a parable of the kingdom. It's not given to us as a guide to the rights of workers in the 1st or indeed the 21st century. It's given to us to help us understand how things work in God's kingdom, in his vineyard. The context of the parable is also important. It follows immediately after a conversation that Jesus has with his disciples about money and rewards. This conversation is prompted by Jesus' encounter with a rich young man who comes to Jesus with the question, "What good deed must I do to inherit eternal life?" The question betrays his belief that God needs to be bargained with. If you do enough good things, there will be a heavenly return. Entrance into God's kingdom is something that you earn. And Jesus demolishes this line of thinking by telling the man to give up his possessions and come and follow him. His possessions had become his security. In his mind, they showed that God favoured him. Jesus says you can only come into the kingdom with empty hands. You can't earn or buy your way into it. So that is what Jesus meant when he said on another occasion that unless you become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Children have no possessions, no pretensions, no qualifications. They come as they are. And the rich young man went away sad because he had many possessions. Well, the episode with this man had a sobering effect on the disciples. They'd always believed that being wealthy or having wealth was a sign of God's blessing. Jesus now tells them that you may be better off without it. Peter did a quick rethink and asked the follow-up question, "We have left everything and followed you. What then will we have?" And behind Peter's question is the thought, we have given up our jobs, sacrificed our homes and families, risked everything in order to follow you. Surely there must be something that must be worth something. Surely we can expect a better place in your kingdom than some Johnny-come-lately, some Gentile who's never kept the law, never been part of God's covenant, and late in life suddenly decides to become a follower of Jesus. In response, Jesus assures Peter that there are rewards for following him. He says that they will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But then he adds, many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. In other words, Jesus says, don't keep your eye on what others are doing or are receiving. Just be thankful that you are in my vineyard, where everyone is treated with equal generosity. To work in God's vineyard, to be part of his family, is a gift. It's about grace. Michael Card, in his commentary on Matthew, gives a working definition of grace. When the person from whom I have a right to expect nothing gives me everything. The labourers in the parable were content when they were dealing with the landowner alone. It was only when they started comparing themselves with the others that they became unhappy. We're all prone to jealousy. We easily become envious of someone who has more than we have, wealthier, more gifted, more attractive than us. The parable warns that we will never be able to see the goodness of God if we have a jealous eye, if we keep looking at our neighbour to see if they've received more than we have. To be a follower of Jesus means that we have all that we need. We're part of a family where we have forgiveness, the assurance of eternal life in God's presence, and brothers and sisters, companions on the road. There's no end to God's grace. It can't be measured or quantified. It's measureless, inexhaustible. The good things we do, going to church, caring for others, are not done in order to win brownie points. They're done in response to the extravagant love of God poured out on us. As Philip Yancey puts it in his book, what's so amazing about grace. There is nothing I can do to make God love me more. And there is nothing I can do to make God love me less.